Quentin Wallace, 42, repaired commercial refrigeration systems across Milwaukee. Most people saw a tired tradesman with an old Chevy van. His wife, Lauren, told her lawyer, Quentin, had no assets worth fighting for. The evidence seemed obvious: worn boots, gas station coffee, 12-hour workdays. What Lauren didn't know was that Quentin quietly owned something far larger than she had ever imagined. 2 days after filing for divorce, her attorney called back. Lauren felt her stomach tighten as he said, "There's something you need to know about your husband." Before we continue, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. It's always fascinating to see how many different places these stories reach. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, hidden truths, and people who are underestimated until the facts come out, make sure to subscribe. There are many more stories like this ahead. The first time Quentin Wallace met Lauren Parker was in the summer of 2011. She was 24, ambitious, and working at a small real estate office near Milwaukee's historic 3rd Ward. Quentin was 27 and spending most of his days inside restaurant kitchens, repairing commercial freezers and refrigeration units that seemed to break down at the worst possible moments. Their first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The second lasted nearly 3 hours. At the time, neither of them had much money. Lauren drove a used Honda Civic with over 140,000 miles on it. Quentin owned a pickup truck so old that the driver's side window had to be rolled down by hand. Neither cared. Back then, they spent Friday nights eating burgers at Kopp's Frozen Custard. They walked along Lake Michigan during the summer. They talked about buying a home one day. The future seemed simple. For several years, it was. Quentin worked hard, very hard. He often left home before sunrise and returned long after dark. Milwaukee winters were brutal, but restaurant refrigerators did not care about snowstorms. When equipment failed, somebody had to fix it. Most of the time, that somebody was Quentin. Lauren used to admire that about him. She would wait awake for him. Sometimes she brought dinner to his workshop. Sometimes she sat beside him while he worked on invoices late into the night. Those moments slowly disappeared. The change happened gradually enough that Quentin almost missed it. Almost. Lauren's real estate career began improving around 2017. Then it improved again and again. The housing market surged. Commission checks became larger. The clients became wealthier. The parties became more exclusive. Quentin noticed new names entering conversations: developers, investors, luxury home brokers, people who seemed to measure success by the watch on a man's wrist and the vehicle parked in his driveway. At first, Lauren only talked about them. Later, she began comparing Quentin to them. The comparisons were subtle: a comment here, a joke there, a disappointed look when Quentin arrived at an event wearing work boots after coming directly from a service call. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth fighting about. But Quentin remembered every one. One evening, they attended a charity fundraiser at the Pfister Hotel. Most of the guests wore tailored suits and designer dresses. Quentin arrived 30 minutes late after repairing a refrigeration failure at a grocery distribution center outside the city. He had changed clothes, he had showered, yet traces of grease still remained beneath his fingernails. Lauren noticed. The expression on her face lasted only a second, but Quentin saw it. Embarrassment. The feeling disappeared almost immediately. Lauren smiled, introduced him to people, continued the evening, yet Quentin could not forget that brief moment. The look had said more than any argument ever could. Over the following years, the distance grew. Lauren became increasingly involved in Milwaukee's real estate circles. Networking dinners, private events, weekend conferences in Chicago, business retreats in Scottsdale. The calendar filled quickly. Quentin rarely complained. He simply observed. That was what he had always done. Observe first, speak later, sometimes never. The house they shared in Brookfield remained peaceful on the surface. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations, no broken dishes, no slammed doors. Instead, there was something colder: silence. the kind that slowly settles between two people who have stopped moving toward each other. Quentin noticed small things. Lauren spent more time on her phone. She laughed at messages she never shared. She protected the screen whenever he walked nearby. Sometimes she stayed awake long after midnight. The glow of her phone illuminated the bedroom ceiling. Quentin would glance toward her, then close his eyes again, not because he didn't care, because he was waiting. People revealed themselves eventually. They always did. One rainy Thursday evening in October, Quentin returned home later than expected. A compressor failure at a downtown steakhouse had delayed him nearly 4 hours. The driveway was wet. The porch light was on. Inside the house, everything appeared normal. Lauren sat in the living room. Her attention was fixed on her phone. She was typing quickly, smiling, focused. Quentin stepped through the front door. The reaction was immediate. Lauren's smile vanished. Her thumb moved across the screen. The phone locked instantly, too quickly, far too quickly. For a brief moment, Quentin saw concern flash across her face. Then it disappeared. "Long day?" Lauren asked. "Long enough." He placed his keys on the counter. She set the phone face down, a small movement. Most people would have ignored it. Quentin didn't. Years of diagnosing equipment failures had trained him to notice details. The sound before a motor died, the vibration before a compressor failed. Tiny signs, small warnings. This felt similar. Neither mentioned it. Dinner continued normally. Conversation remained polite, predictable, safe. But something had changed. Later that night, Lauren fell asleep first. Quentin remained awake. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The digital clock beside the bed displayed 12:43 a.m. His eyes moved toward Lauren's phone resting on the nightstand. He had never checked her messages before, not once. He wasn't interested in spying. Trust worked differently than that. Yet something about tonight felt different. Not because of suspicion, because of certainty. Certainty that a decision had already been made somewhere beyond his view. The phone vibrated once, a new message. The screen illuminated briefly, only briefly, but long enough. Quentin did not pick up the device. He did not touch it. He simply saw the preview. One name, 2 words, nothing more. Gavin Pierce. His stomach tightened slightly, not from fear, recognition. The name meant something. Gavin Pierce was one of Milwaukee's most respected divorce attorneys. The message disappeared seconds later. The room became dark again. Lauren continued sleeping. Quentin stared at the ceiling, calm, quiet, thinking. A minute passed, then another. Outside, rainwater slid down the glass. Inside, Quentin slowly connected pieces that had been accumulating for months. The late-night messages, the growing distance, the secrecy. The careful way Lauren had hidden her phone, the name on the screen. He still felt no anger, only clarity, because for the first time the direction of everything became visible, and somewhere across Milwaukee, attorney Gavin Pierce was already preparing paperwork that would soon arrive at Quentin Wallace's front door. The offices of Pierce and Adler Family Law occupied the 22nd floor of a glass tower overlooking downtown Milwaukee. The view was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Lake Michigan in the distance. Luxury condos lined the shoreline. Expensive cars moved through morning traffic far below. Lauren Wallace liked the building. It looked successful, important, the kind of place where problems got solved quickly. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, she walked into the office carrying a leather portfolio and a sense of certainty. The receptionist greeted her by name. A few minutes later, she was sitting across from Gavin Pierce. Gavin was 51 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades handling high-asset divorces throughout Wisconsin. He had seen wealthy executives hide millions. He had seen spouses move money through shell companies. He had seen people lie under oath and destroy their own cases. Compared to those situations, Lauren's divorce initially appeared simple, very simple. Gavin opened a yellow legal pad. "Tell me about your husband." Lauren leaned back. The answer came quickly. "His name is Quentin Wallace. He repairs refrigeration systems." Gavin nodded. Business owner? Not really. Investments? Not that I'm aware of. Retirement accounts? Nothing significant. Gavin continued taking notes. What assets are we looking at? Lauren crossed her arms. The house in Brookfield. The joint savings account. Some furniture. Vehicles. She paused, then shrugged. Honestly, there isn't much. Gavin looked up. Any hidden assets? Lauren smiled slightly. No. The confidence in her voice sounded genuine. Not because she had investigated Quentin's finances, because she had stopped paying attention to his work years ago. In her mind, she already knew who Quentin was. A hard-working repair technician, a decent man, a simple man, not a wealthy one, not an ambitious one, certainly not someone with complicated financial holdings. Gavin continued asking questions. Most of the answers followed the same pattern. Lauren knew very little about Quentin's business activities. She could not identify his clients. She did not know the size of his revenue. She had never reviewed his tax filings. She had never asked. And because she had never asked, she assumed the answers were unimportant. The meeting lasted less than an hour. By the end, Gavin believed the case would likely settle quickly. No major assets, no children. No obvious complications, just another marriage that had quietly reached its expiration date. He explained the filing process. Lauren listened carefully, then signed the paperwork. When she left the office, she felt lighter, relieved, certain. The difficult part was over, or so she thought. 2 days later, Gavin's legal assistant began preparing preliminary financial disclosures. The process was routine. Every divorce required background verification, property searches, corporate records, tax information, public filings. Most of the work was automated through subscription databases used by law firms. Usually, the searches revealed nothing surprising. A house, a checking account, maybe a small retirement fund. That was all. Shortly after 10 o'clock that morning, Gavin's assistant Rachel frowned at her computer screen. Something didn't look right. She refreshed the search, ran it again. The same result appeared. Rachel leaned forward, then searched a second database. Again, the same result. A third database, same result. Her expression changed. She picked up a folder and walked toward Gavin's office. He was reviewing another case when she knocked. Got a minute? Without looking up, Gavin answered. Sure. Rachel stepped inside. You might want to see this. Gavin accepted the documents. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed a company name, North Harbor Holdings, LLC. His eyes paused. He turned the page, then another and another. What is this? Rachel sat down. That's what I thought. Gavin continued reading. The record showed an active Wisconsin limited liability company, multiple subsidiaries, commercial service agreements, equipment leasing operations, maintenance contracts, business assets. The numbers attached to those filings were not small, not even close. Gavin looked up. Are we sure this belongs to Quentin Wallace? Rachel nodded. I checked 3 times. Same address, same tax identification trail. Same ownership records. The room became quiet. Gavin leaned back in his chair. Something wasn't adding up. During their consultation, Lauren had described Quentin as a man with almost nothing worth pursuing. A repair technician, a laborer, a husband whose financial picture could be summarized in a few pages. The records in front of him told a different story, a very different story. Gavin opened additional reports. The deeper he looked, the stranger things became. North Harbor Holdings had existed for nearly a decade. Several affiliated entities appeared tied to commercial service operations throughout Wisconsin. Madison, Green Bay, Appleton, Eau Claire, Kenosha. Contracts stretched across multiple cities. There were references to healthcare facilities, restaurant groups, regional grocery chains. The company was not enormous, but it was substantial. Substantial enough that no competent attorney could ignore it. Gavin stood and walked toward the windows. Below him, Milwaukee traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. His mind replayed the consultation. Every answer Lauren had given, every assumption, every statement, particularly one. He doesn't have any assets worth fighting for. The sentence sounded very different now. Gavin returned to his desk. Get me everything. Rachel nodded. I'm already pulling corporate filings. Good. What about the divorce filing? Gavin stared at the paperwork. Leave it active. But we need answers. The next several hours revealed additional concerns. Not all of them involved Quentin. Some involved Lauren. Financial disclosures worked both ways. Whenever one spouse's finances came under review, the other spouse's records often followed. Certain spending patterns began appearing. Large credit card balances, luxury purchases, travel expenses, nothing illegal, but enough to attract attention, especially in a divorce case. By late afternoon, Gavin had stopped viewing the matter as simple. Simple cases rarely produced surprises. This one had already produced several. At 4:17 p.m., he finally picked up his phone. Lauren answered after the second ring. Hi, Gavin. Her tone was relaxed, casual. She sounded like someone expecting a routine update. Instead, Gavin asked a question. Lauren, how familiar are you with North Harbor Holdings? Silence. A few seconds passed. Then, I've never heard of it. Gavin glanced toward the file. Interesting. What is it? We need to talk. Lauren laughed softly. About what? Gavin did not laugh. The seriousness in his voice immediately changed the mood. It's related to Quentin. Another pause, this one longer. What about Quentin? Gavin looked once more at the growing stack of documents covering his desk. Because for the first time since opening the case, he was no longer sure that Lauren understood who her husband really was. And the more records he reviewed, the more concerned he became about what else might emerge once formal discovery began. 3 days later, Quentin Wallace was standing on the roof of a restaurant in Wauwatosa when the divorce papers arrived. The November wind cut across the rooftop with enough force to sting exposed skin. A refrigeration unit had failed shortly before lunch. Inside the restaurant, employees were rushing to save thousands of dollars in food inventory before temperatures rose too high. Quentin had already diagnosed the problem. A damaged compressor relay. Simple. Replace it. Test the system. Move on to the next job. His phone vibrated just after noon. A message from the restaurant manager. Guy downstairs asking for you. Says it's legal paperwork. Quentin looked toward the gray Wisconsin sky, then climbed down the access ladder. The process server was waiting beside Quentin's van. Middle-aged, professional, uncomfortable. People serving divorce papers often looked that way. The server confirmed Quentin's identity and handed over a thick envelope. No speech, no drama, just paperwork. Quentin thanked him. The man seemed surprised by the response. Most people became angry. Some argued, others demanded explanations. Quentin simply accepted the documents and returned to his vehicle. The heater hummed quietly inside the van. Traffic moved along North Avenue outside. For several moments, Quentin stared at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Then he opened it, page by page, slowly, methodically. The filing contained exactly what he expected. Lauren was seeking dissolution of marriage, division of assets, possession of the Brookfield home, allocation of marital accounts, attorney fees. Nothing unusual, nothing emotional, nothing personal, just legal language transforming 15 years of marriage into numbered paragraphs. Quentin finished reading, then read everything a second time, not because he was shocked, because details mattered. Details always mattered, especially when lawyers became involved. By the time he finished, his lunch break was nearly over. Most people would have called their spouse. Some would have driven home immediately. Others would have contacted friends or family. Quentin did none of those things. Instead, he opened his contacts, scrolled down, pressed one name, Margaret Reed. She answered on the third ring. Margaret Reed, it's Quentin Wallace. A brief pause followed. Then her voice softened. Quentin? She knew him well, not socially, professionally. They had first met 8 years earlier during a business acquisition involving one of Quentin's companies. Margaret specialized in complex financial litigation, business disputes, asset protection, partnership conflicts, and occasionally divorce cases involving significant holdings. "What happened?" she asked. "My wife filed." No surprise entered Margaret's voice. Experienced attorneys learned not to sound surprised. "When were you served?" 10 minutes ago. "Have you signed anything?" "No." "Good." The answer came instantly. "Where are you?" "Wauwatosa." "Can you be in Madison by 6? "Yes." "I'll clear my evening." The call ended. Quentin returned to work. That was the part most people would not have understood. The refrigeration system still needed repair. The restaurant still needed to operate. The employees still needed functioning equipment. So Quentin finished the job, then completed another service call, and another. Only after the workday ended did he begin driving west toward Madison. The sun disappeared long before he arrived. Margaret's office occupied the second floor of a historic brick building near the Capitol. The building lacked the polished luxury of downtown corporate towers, no marble lobby, no dramatic skyline views, just competence, quiet competence, the kind Quentin trusted. Margaret greeted him personally. She was 63 years old, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. Her reputation throughout Wisconsin was formidable. Judges respected her. Attorneys feared her. Clients trusted her. The conference room contained a single folder, the divorce petition. Margaret had already reviewed it. Quentin sat down. She pushed a cup of coffee toward him, then opened the file. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence felt deliberate, strategic. Finally, Margaret folded her hands. "How much does Lauren know?" Quentin considered the question. "About what?" Margaret's eyes remained fixed on him. "Everything." Another pause. Then Quentin gave the answer. "Not much." Margaret nodded slowly. "I figured." She opened several documents, corporate filings, financial summaries, business records. Most bore names unfamiliar to anyone outside Quentin's professional world, yet together they painted a very different picture than the one Lauren had described to her attorney. Margaret turned one page around. North Harbor Holdings, LLC. The company name sat at the top. Quentin glanced at it, the same way someone might glance at an old photograph, without emotion, without pride, just recognition. Years of work condensed into a single sheet of paper. Margaret watched him carefully, then asked the question that mattered. "Does Lauren know about North Harbor?" "No." "You never told her." "I told her what I did." "That's not what I asked." Quentin remained silent. Margaret already understood the answer. There was a difference between telling someone information and having them actually care enough to listen. For years, Quentin had discussed contracts, expansion plans, acquisitions, equipment leasing, commercial maintenance agreements. Lauren simply stopped paying attention, not because he hid it, because she viewed his work as unimportant. Margaret opened another file, then another. The stack continued growing. Each document revealed another layer of Quentin's business interests: service operations, equipment assets, property leases, long-term contracts. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to attract attention, everything designed to generate stable revenue. The structure was remarkably disciplined. Margaret had reviewed hundreds of business portfolios throughout her career. Very few were organized this carefully. "You've done well," she said. Quentin shrugged. "I stayed busy." Margaret almost smiled. Then her attention shifted back to the divorce filing. "The problem isn't your assets." Quentin looked up. "The problem is assumptions." "What assumptions?" Margaret tapped the petition. "Lauren's." She leaned back. "If she truly told her attorney you had nothing significant, then either she doesn't know your finances, or she never bothered learning them." The room became quiet again. Quentin looked toward the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted through downtown Madison, the first real snowfall of the season. He thought about the years behind him, the overtime, the business trips, the weekends spent rebuilding failing operations, The opportunities he passed up to stay close to home, the sacrifices. Most of all, he thought about conversations Lauren had stopped listening to years ago, not because she disagreed, because she no longer cared. Margaret broke the silence. "We're not reacting." Quentin nodded. "Good. We're documenting." Another nod. "We're gathering facts." "Good. We're not making emotional decisions." Quentin almost smiled. "That was never the plan." Margaret finally smiled back. A small one. The kind earned through experience. Then she opened a separate folder. This one contained preliminary financial information connected to Lauren. Only a few pages. Nothing conclusive. Yet something immediately caught her attention. Several transactions had been highlighted. Large purchases, unusual spending, patterns that deserved closer examination. Margaret studied them briefly, then looked at Quentin. "There may be another issue." "What kind of issue?" "I'm not ready to say yet." She closed the folder. "But I want my team reviewing every financial record connected to this marriage." Quentin remained calm, as expected. Margaret appreciated that. Panic complicated legal cases. Anger complicated them even more. Patience was far more useful, especially when facts had not finished revealing themselves. Margaret stood and gathered the documents. "We start tomorrow." Quentin rose as well. The meeting was ending. But before they reached the door, Margaret asked one final question. A question that seemed simple, yet carried enormous weight. "Quentin." He stopped. "Yes." Margaret held up the folder containing Lauren's preliminary financial records. Her expression had changed. The confidence remained. But now curiosity had joined it. Because buried among those transactions was something she did not yet understand. Something unusual, something expensive, something recent. And whatever it was, Margaret suspected it would become very important before this divorce was over. The story Lauren told herself about Quentin Wallace had become so familiar that she no longer questioned it. He was a repairman, a dependable repairman, a hard-working repairman, but still just a repairman. The version of Quentin that existed inside her mind had not changed in years. Meanwhile, the real Quentin had changed dramatically, not in appearance, not in lifestyle, not in ways visible to casual observers. His transformation happened quietly, one contract at a time, one acquisition at a time, one calculated decision after another. 3 days after their meeting in Madison, Margaret Reed sat inside her office reviewing a timeline that stretched back nearly 10 years. Across her desk sat Quentin. A legal pad rested in front of him. Coffee steamed beside it. Outside, snow covered the sidewalks around Capitol Square. Inside, Margaret was reconstructing the story of North Harbor Holdings. Not for Quentin. He already knew it. For the court. Because eventually every detail would matter. "Let's start from the beginning," Margaret said. Quentin nodded. The beginning wasn't glamorous. It rarely was. In 2014, Quentin had been working 70-hour weeks, repairing refrigeration systems throughout southeastern Wisconsin. He worked for a regional service company at the time. The pay was decent. The hours were brutal. The future was limited. Then he learned about a small refrigeration contractor in Green Bay called Harbor Mechanical Services. The company was failing. The owner was retiring. The business had lost several major clients. Most people saw a sinking ship. Quentin saw opportunity. He spent months studying the numbers. Every evening after work, every weekend, every holiday, he analyzed service records, equipment inventories, customer retention rates, debt obligations, profit margins. When he finally made an offer, people thought he was crazy. The company was losing money. The equipment was outdated. The future was uncertain. Quentin bought it anyway. He used nearly every dollar he had saved. Then he went to work. Not as an owner sitting behind a desk, as a technician. The first 2 years were exhausting. He handled repairs during the day, paperwork at night, payroll on weekends, sales calls whenever possible. Sometimes he slept 4 hours, sometimes less. Margaret reviewed those years carefully. The numbers told a remarkable story. Steady growth, nothing dramatic, nothing reckless. Every year slightly stronger than the year before. One contract became 3, 3 became 8, 8 became 15. A grocery chain hired them, then a hospital, then a regional restaurant group. By 2018, the company was profitable. By 2020, it was thriving. And by 2022, Quentin had reorganized everything under a new parent company, North Harbor Holdings, LLC. The name appeared simple, almost forgettable. That was intentional. Quentin disliked flashy branding. He preferred stability, predictability, results. Margaret flipped to another page. The current numbers were impressive. Not billionaire impressive, not private jet impressive. Real wealth, business wealth, the kind built slowly over years. North Harbor controlled multiple service operations throughout Wisconsin. Commercial refrigeration, equipment maintenance, industrial cooling systems, specialized repair contracts, equipment leasing, emergency service agreements. The combined annual revenue exceeded $12 million. The valuation estimates varied. Most fell between 18 and 24 million. Margaret looked up. You never told Lauren? Quentin considered the question, then shook his head. Not exactly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? I talked about work. You talked about contracts. Yes. Growth. Yes. Expansion. Yes. Margaret smiled faintly, and she stopped listening. Quentin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence provided the answer. Years earlier, Lauren had asked questions. She attended business dinners. She celebrated new contracts. She listened when Quentin described expansion plans. Gradually, those conversations disappeared. Not because Quentin hid them, because Lauren lost interest, especially after her own career accelerated. The wealthier her social circle became, the less impressive Quentin seemed. A man driving an aging van simply didn't fit the image, even if he owned the company that paid for it. Margaret continued reviewing records. The discipline impressed her. Many successful business owners developed expensive habits, luxury vehicles, vacation homes, boats, status purchases. Quentin had done none of those things. His personal spending remained remarkably ordinary. The same Brookfield home, the same practical vehicles, the same modest routines. His wealth existed largely inside businesses and investments, not appearances. That distinction mattered, especially in divorce court. Margaret closed one file, opened another. This one contained property records, commercial leases, equipment inventories, insurance documents. Each record reinforced the same conclusion. North Harbor had not appeared overnight. It had been built methodically over nearly a decade, which created another problem for Lauren's case. The more documentation Margaret reviewed, the more obvious it became that much of the company's value originated from carefully structured business entities established long before many of the disputed financial issues appeared. The legal implications were significant, very significant. A knock interrupted the meeting. Margaret's paralegal entered carrying a folder. I found what you asked for. Margaret accepted it. Anything interesting? The paralegal hesitated, then nodded. Possibly. Margaret opened the folder. Inside were preliminary financial summaries connected to Lauren, credit card records, bank activity, expense reports, nothing definitive. Yet several entries immediately stood out. Luxury retailers, designer boutiques, high-end travel expenses, resort charges, thousands of dollars spread across dozens of transactions. Margaret reviewed them carefully. The spending itself wasn't necessarily a problem. People spent money. That happened. What mattered was where the money originated and whether those expenditures had been properly disclosed. Several entries raised questions. Questions Margaret intended to answer. Quentin watched quietly. He never asked to see the folder, never leaned forward, never demanded explanations. Margaret noticed. Most clients wanted immediate answers. Quentin wanted facts. There was a difference, a very important difference. Finally, Margaret closed the folder. I think Lauren may have some financial issues she hasn't disclosed. Quentin remained expressionless. What kind of issues? I'm not ready to say. How serious? Margaret tapped the folder. Potentially serious. Outside the office window, snow continued falling. Inside, the room felt increasingly focused. The divorce was no longer a simple disagreement between spouses. Layers were beginning to emerge. Financial layers, legal layers, personal layers. The kind that transformed routine cases into complicated ones. Margaret stood and walked toward a wall covered with case materials. A timeline stretched across several boards. Business acquisitions, property purchases, financial events, contract milestones. Now she added another category, Lauren's spending, one transaction at a time. A pattern slowly began forming, not complete, not yet, but visible enough to attract attention. Then something caught her eye, a specific transaction, one charge among dozens. The amount wasn't enormous, less than many others, yet the location attached to it made her stop. She looked again, then again. The charge had been processed only 3 months earlier. The merchant name appeared clearly on the statement. The Langford Hotel, Milwaukee, luxury accommodations. Margaret's expression changed slightly. The hotel itself wasn't unusual, but the timing was. And several other transactions appeared connected to the same period. Travel, dining, entertainment, enough to justify deeper investigation. She slowly closed the file, then looked at Quentin. We may have found our starting point. Quentin followed her gaze toward the highlighted transaction. For the first time that afternoon, something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not shock, recognition. Because although he had never stayed at the Langford Hotel himself, he knew exactly where it was. And suddenly Margaret had a feeling that the story hidden behind that charge would lead them somewhere neither Lauren nor her attorney expected. The following week, Margaret Reed's office became a center of controlled activity. Paralegals moved between conference rooms carrying folders. Financial analysts reviewed statements. Corporate records were organized into timelines. Every document connected to Quentin and Lauren Wallace was being examined. Not because Margaret expected scandal, because assumptions had already proven dangerous. The divorce had begun with one very expensive mistake. Lauren had assumed she understood Quentin's finances. Now, Margaret intended to understand all of them, including Lauren's. On Monday morning, Quentin arrived at Margaret's office before 8. He carried a notebook and a travel mug filled with black coffee, nothing else. Most clients arrived with questions. Quentin arrived with records. The distinction mattered. Margaret appreciated people who respected facts. She greeted him in the conference room. A large screen displayed spreadsheets and transaction histories. Several folders sat neatly arranged across the table. One folder was significantly thicker than the others. Margaret noticed Quentin looking at it. That's Lauren's spending. Quentin nodded once. No visible reaction. Margaret opened the folder. Let's walk through what we've found. The first pages contained standard household expenses, utilities, groceries, insurance, mortgage payments, nothing unusual. Then the pattern shifted. Luxury purchases began appearing with increasing frequency. Designer handbags, jewelry boutiques, premium department stores, weekend resort bookings, fine dining charges, spa packages. The totals added up quickly. Several $1,000s here, several thousand more there. Month after month, year after year. Individually, none of the transactions seemed extraordinary. Together, they painted a different picture. Margaret tapped a column on the spreadsheet. These charges increased significantly during the last 3 years. Quentin studied the numbers. The increase was obvious. Did she hide them? Margaret shook her head. Not exactly. Then what's the issue? Source of funds. That was where things became complicated. Some purchases came from Lauren's personal accounts. Those were her responsibility. Others came from joint marital accounts. Again, not necessarily unusual. Married couples spent joint money. That happened every day. The concern involved a third category. Margaret opened another document. Several highlighted entries appeared. Quentin leaned forward slightly. For the first time that morning, the transactions originated from an account connected to one of North Harbor's operating entities, not directly, indirectly, a business expense account, an account Lauren should not have been using. Margaret pointed to the dates. "Do you recognize these?" Quentin examined them carefully, then nodded. "Corporate travel account." "Correct." "How much?" Margaret slid over a summary page. The number at the bottom exceeded $80,000. The room remained silent. Not because the amount was devastating. For North Harbor, it wasn't. The issue was authorization. Every transaction required approval. Every legitimate expense required documentation. Many of these charges had neither. Quentin looked through the records again, slowly, methodically. A habit developed through years of troubleshooting complex systems. Find the pattern, ignore the emotion, follow the evidence. Several transactions immediately stood out. Luxury retail stores in Chicago, high-end restaurants, resort bookings in Arizona, premium airline tickets. None appeared connected to business operations. Margaret watched him. Most clients became angry at this stage. Quentin became focused. That difference was becoming increasingly important. "What happens now?" he asked. "We document everything." "That's all, for now." Margaret closed the folder. "Remember, discovery hasn't started." The word carried weight. Discovery. The stage of litigation where assumptions stopped mattering. Documents mattered, records mattered, facts mattered. Every bank statement, every receipt, every transfer, every expense, everything became visible, and visibility was dangerous for people who relied on appearances. Margaret opened another file. This one contained a developing timeline. The dates covered approximately 18 months. Something interesting appeared almost immediately. Several large spending periods clustered together. The purchases weren't random. They followed a pattern. Luxury purchases often occurred within days of specific trips. Trips Lauren had described as business travel, real estate conferences, networking events, professional retreats. The explanation seemed reasonable until the financial records entered the picture. Then questions emerged. Questions Margaret intended to answer. She highlighted several dates. "Look at this." Quentin studied the timeline. Conference in Chicago, luxury purchases, hotel expenses, private dining charges. Another conference 3 weeks later, similar spending, then another and another. The repetition was difficult to ignore. Still, nothing proved misconduct. Not yet. Margaret understood the difference. Patterns created questions, evidence created answers, and she preferred answers. The investigation continued, hour after hour, document after document. By late afternoon, another layer began appearing. Several transactions involved a recurring merchant, not a store, not a restaurant, not an airline, a hotel, the Langford Hotel, Milwaukee, 5-star accommodations, private event spaces, luxury suites. Margaret recognized the property immediately. The Langford was popular among executives, investors, and visiting professionals. It was expensive, extremely expensive. She reviewed the dates, then compared them with Lauren's calendar entries. The overlap was interesting, very interesting. According to several records, Lauren had stayed there multiple times, despite living less than 30 minutes away. That made little sense. People didn't typically book luxury hotel suites in their own city without a reason. Margaret marked each occurrence, then continued digging. Another analyst entered the room carrying additional reports. "I found something." Margaret accepted the documents. "What guest records aren't available?" "They never are. But corporate billing references are." That got her attention. The analyst handed over several pages. Certain expenses linked to the Langford included accompanying charges, room service, valet parking, private dining, conference reservations. Most importantly, some entries referenced a second guest account. Not a full name, just initials, EC. Margaret looked up. Anything else? The analyst nodded. We cross-referenced local business registrations. Several pages changed hands. Margaret reviewed them carefully. Then her eyes narrowed. E.C. Ethan Cole, a real estate investor based in Milwaukee. Successful, well-connected, frequently involved in commercial development projects. The same professional circles Lauren had been moving through for years. Margaret said nothing, not yet. The information was incomplete, but it was enough to justify further investigation. Across the table, Quentin remained calm. He hadn't seen the name yet. Margaret considered whether to mention it, then decided against it. Facts first, conclusions later. That principle had served her well throughout her career. The meeting eventually ended. Quentin gathered his notebook, finished his coffee, prepared to leave. At the door, Margaret stopped him. I need you to remember something. He waited. Whatever we find, don't react. A faint smile appeared. You've told me that 3 times. And I'll tell you 3 more. Quentin nodded, because he understood exactly why she kept repeating it. Reaction created mistakes. Patience created leverage. Outside, evening darkness had settled across Madison. Streetlights reflected off fresh snow. Quentin walked toward his truck alone. His breath drifted into the cold air. Inside his pocket, his phone vibrated. A routine service notification from one of North Harbor's maintenance divisions. Nothing dramatic, just another problem requiring attention. A refrigeration unit in Green Bay needed repairs. Business continued. Life continued. Yet somewhere behind the ordinary routines, something larger was forming. Margaret remained in her office for nearly 2 more hours. The Langford transaction stayed on her desk. The initials EC remained highlighted. The timeline continued growing. And the deeper she examined Lauren's financial history, the more convinced she became that the Langford Hotel was not merely an expensive place to stay. It was a doorway leading toward answers, answers connected to Ethan Cole, answers connected to money, and answers that might eventually explain why Lauren had become so confident that Quentin Wallace would never fight back. The Langford Hotel stood 6 blocks from Milwaukee's lakefront, 22 stories of polished stone glass and quiet luxury. Business executives stayed there, professional athletes stayed there, developers closing multi-million-dollar deals stayed there. It was not the kind of place someone booked casually, especially not someone who lived 28 minutes away. That fact stayed with Margaret Reed. 3 days after identifying the transactions, she sat alone in her office reviewing the timeline again. The charges connected to the Langford Hotel covered nearly 14 months, not dozens of visits, just enough. Enough to establish a pattern, enough to raise questions, questions that deserved answers. Across Wisconsin, Quentin Wallace spent that same morning visiting 3 job sites: a grocery distribution center in Kenosha, a restaurant chain location outside Racine, a hospital refrigeration system in Oak Creek. The routine felt familiar, comforting even. Machines broke. Problems appeared. Solutions followed. Unlike people, equipment rarely lied. At 11:32, his phone rang. Margaret. He answered immediately. What did you find? Margaret did not waste time. I think we're ready to verify something. What? The Langford. Quentin pulled into an empty parking space beside a loading dock. The engine idled quietly. What about it? The spending pattern isn't random. Silence followed, not because Quentin was surprised, because he was listening. Margaret appreciated that. Most clients interrupted. Quentin collected information. I've got dates, she continued. I've got billing records. I've got overlapping transactions. But I want confirmation. What kind? Margaret looked toward the documents spread across her desk, the kind that turns suspicion into evidence. That afternoon, one of Margaret's investigators began reviewing publicly available information connected to Ethan Cole. Nothing illegal, nothing secret, Professional profiles, corporate registrations, industry events, business conferences, commercial development projects. The investigator's report arrived before sunset. Margaret read every page. The connections appeared quickly. Ethan Cole moved within exactly the same professional circles Lauren had entered during the previous several years. Commercial real estate, investment networking groups, development conferences, private fundraising events, exclusive membership organizations. The overlap was substantial. Still, overlap meant nothing by itself. Milwaukee's business community was not enormous. Successful people often attended the same events. Margaret needed more. The following morning brought it: a photograph, then another, then 3 more, all publicly available, all perfectly legal: conference receptions, fundraising galas, development events. Lauren appeared in several images, so did Ethan, always nearby, sometimes standing together, sometimes seated at the same table, never inappropriate, never compromising, yet the frequency stood out. Margaret organized everything into the growing timeline. Then she called Quentin again. This time he arrived at her office in person. Snow covered Madison's sidewalks. The conference room felt warm by comparison. Margaret laid several photographs across the table. Quentin studied them carefully. His expression never changed. Not once. Years earlier, that might have surprised her. Now it didn't. Quentin's reactions happened internally, always had. "What do you think?" she asked. He examined another photo. Lauren standing beside Ethan during a commercial development fundraiser. Nothing unusual, nothing incriminating. Then another, a charity event, same result. Then another, a networking dinner. Again, Ethan, Lauren, the same circles, the same events, the same period reflected in the financial records. Finally, Quentin placed the photographs down. "How long?" Margaret understood the question immediately. "I don't know." That answer mattered because Margaret refused to guess. Facts, not assumptions. Evidence, not theories. The investigation continued. Later that afternoon, another piece arrived. This one more significant. One of the Langford transactions included a reservation reference connected to a private dining suite. The reservation had been billed through a corporate event package. The package listed 2 attendees. One name was partially redacted. The other wasn't. Ethan Cole. Margaret read the report twice, then a third time. The information still required verification, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss the pattern as coincidence. By Thursday evening, Quentin sat alone inside his Brookfield home. The house felt different now. Larger, quieter. Lauren had moved into a downtown apartment shortly after filing. Many of her belongings were already gone. The empty spaces remained. A chair missing from the dining room, photographs removed from shelves, closets half empty, evidence of a life being dismantled piece by piece. Quentin stood in the kitchen. A folder rested on the counter. The Langford records, photographs, financial summaries, evidence, not conclusions, evidence. The distinction mattered. For a long time he stared through the window toward the backyard. Snow had begun falling again. The deck was covered. The trees were white. Everything looked still. 15 years. That number remained difficult to process. Not because the marriage had ended, because of how quietly it ended. No final argument, no dramatic confession, no explosion, just distance, then paperwork. His phone vibrated. A text from Margaret. Simple, direct. "Can you come in tomorrow morning? We have something new." The next morning, Quentin arrived shortly after 9. Margaret looked different, more focused, more certain. Several new documents sat on the conference table. She waited until he sat down, then slid 1 page forward. A receipt, the Langford Hotel, private dining reservation, 2 guests, date, time, billing details. The receipt itself wasn't extraordinary. The attached information was a valet parking record, vehicle description, license plate information, registered owner, Ethan Cole. Quentin read the page carefully, then another and another. Margaret remained silent, allowing him time. Eventually he set the documents down. Verified, yes. The answer came immediately. No doubt, no doubt. The room grew quiet. Outside the window, traffic moved through downtown Madison. Inside, years of uncertainty continued transforming into facts. Not every fact, not yet, but enough. Enough to understand that Lauren and Ethan's connection extended far beyond professional networking events. Enough to understand why luxury hotel charges appeared repeatedly throughout the financial records. Enough to understand why so much money had flowed toward places unrelated to business. Still, Quentin felt no desire for confrontation, no desire for revenge. Those emotions seemed oddly distant. What mattered now was documentation, the truth, and the legal process already moving forward. Margaret finally spoke. There's something else. Quentin looked up. She handed him another report. This one came from a review of electronic financial communications. Nothing private, nothing illegally obtained, just records associated with disclosed accounts. Several payments appeared, small compared to the larger expenditures, yet unusual. Consulting fees, recurring transfers, business-related descriptions. Margaret tapped one section. These transactions concern me. Quentin reviewed them. The recipient name appeared repeatedly. A consulting entity, one that ultimately traced back to Ethan Cole. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were consistent, month after month, month after month, month after month. Margaret folded her hands. If these payments weren't legitimate business expenses, we've got a serious problem. The implications hung in the room. Unauthorized spending, undisclosed financial relationships, potential misuse of marital funds. The divorce was becoming more complicated by the day. And somewhere across Milwaukee, Gavin Pierce had just received updated financial reports from his own investigative team. Reports containing information about North Harbor Holdings, information far larger than anything Lauren had originally disclosed. 20 minutes later, Gavin picked up his phone. His expression had changed completely from the confidence he displayed during their first consultation. Then he dialed Lauren's number. When she answered, his first words were calm, careful, measured. "Lauren," he said, "we need to talk immediately." Quentin Wallace was standing inside a model home in Mequon when Gavin Pierce called. The property was listed at $1.8 million. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a wooded preserve. White oak flooring stretched across the main level. The kitchen featured imported stone countertops and custom cabinetry. A young couple toured the house while Lauren explained financing options. Her phone vibrated. Gavin Pierce. She smiled slightly. Finally. For the last week, she had been waiting for updates. In her mind, the divorce process was moving exactly as expected. Quentin would eventually accept reality. The paperwork would be finalized. The assets would be divided. Life would continue. She excused herself and stepped onto the rear patio. The cold Wisconsin air immediately wrapped around her. "Hi, Gavin." No greeting came from the other end. Only silence, brief, measured. Then, "Lauren, where are you?" The question felt strange. "Working. I need you to listen carefully." Something in his tone caused her stomach to tighten. "What happened?" Gavin glanced toward the stack of documents covering his desk. Financial reports, corporate filings, business registrations, asset summaries. The pile seemed larger every day. "We have a problem." Lauren frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The information you provided during our initial consultation appears incomplete." She blinked. "I don't understand." Neither did I. The answer was calm, almost too calm. Then Gavin continued. "Tell me again what you know about Quentin's assets." Lauren felt irritation creeping into her voice. "We already discussed this." "Humor me." The patience in Gavin's tone had changed. It was no longer the patience of an attorney explaining legal procedures. It was the patience of someone verifying facts. Lauren crossed her arms. "He owns half the house. He has some savings. He repairs refrigeration equipment. That's about it? Silence. Then Gavin exhaled slowly. No. The single word landed harder than she expected. What do you mean, no? I mean, that's not about it. Lauren laughed, a short, nervous laugh. Then what is it? Gavin looked down at a valuation report. North Harbor Holdings. The name meant nothing to her, absolutely nothing. What is that? Gavin leaned back. A company. Lauren shrugged. So, a company owned by Quentin. The irritation vanished. Confusion replaced it. What company? North Harbor Holdings, LLC. I've never heard of it. I know. The answer came immediately. Lauren suddenly felt uncomfortable. The conversation was no longer moving in the direction she expected. She stepped farther away from the house, away from the prospective buyers, away from the sales presentation she had been conducting. What exactly are you saying? Gavin chose his words carefully. Lauren, based on what we've discovered, Quentin's financial profile is significantly different from what you described. How different? A pause, then very different. Lauren stared across the snow-covered backyard. The silence stretched. Finally, she asked the obvious question. How much money are we talking about? Gavin did not provide a direct number, not yet. The valuation process wasn't complete, but he gave enough information. Revenue, business contracts, commercial holdings, regional operations, multiple entities. The words seemed unreal, like they belonged to someone else. Not Quentin, not the man who drove an old van, not the man who wore faded work boots, not the man who drank convenience store coffee every morning. That version of Quentin could not possibly own a company worth millions. Could he? Lauren suddenly realized something unsettling. She genuinely didn't know. Years had passed since she last paid attention when Quentin talked about work. Entire conversations had become background noise. Contracts, expansion plans, acquisitions, service territories. She remembered hearing those words. She simply never listened. Gavin's voice pulled her back. There's another issue. Lauren's stomach tightened again. What now? The statements in your filing. What about them? You represented Quentin as having limited assets. Because that's what I believed. I understand. Gavin paused. But beliefs don't matter. Facts do. The sentence hit harder than she expected. For the first time since filing for divorce, Lauren felt uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Not about Quentin, about herself. Had she made a mistake? A serious one, Gavin continued. Discovery works both ways. Lauren frowned. What does that mean? It means once financial disclosure begins, both parties become transparent. The explanation sounded simple. The implications weren't. Every account, every purchase, every transfer, every financial decision, everything became visible. Lauren looked toward the model home. The young couple remained inside, smiling, touring rooms, discussing their future. For a brief moment she envied them. Then the feeling passed. What are you telling me to do? Gavin answered immediately. Be completely honest. The response irritated her. I haven't lied. I didn't say you did. Then why? Because this case just became much more complicated. The words settled heavily between them. Lauren ended the call 15 minutes later. The rest of the afternoon felt different, distracted, unfocused. Every time she spoke to clients, part of her mind remained elsewhere. North Harbor Holdings. The name repeated itself, again and again and again. That evening she sat alone in her downtown apartment, laptop open, wine glass untouched. Search results filled the screen. North Harbor Holdings. There it was. Public records, corporate registrations, commercial filings, business addresses. The information wasn't hidden. It had never been hidden. That realization bothered her most. If she could find it in minutes, why hadn't she known about it? The answer arrived almost immediately, because she never looked. A memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, Quentin discussing a contract expansion during dinner. She had barely listened. Another memory. A conversation about acquiring service operations near Green Bay. She had checked her phone while he talked. Another, a discussion about new maintenance agreements with hospital systems. She had interrupted him halfway through. None of those moments seemed important at the time. Now they felt different, much different. Across town, Quentin sat inside a small diner near Brookfield. Nothing fancy, a place he had visited for years. Margaret Reed sat across from him. A legal folder rested between them. The evening crowd filled most of the booths. Coffee cups clinked softly. Conversations blended into background noise. Margaret reviewed notes. He knows. Quentin nodded. Gavin, yes. Expected. The waitress refilled their coffee. Neither spoke until she left. Then Margaret continued. The call probably happened today. Again, Quentin nodded. No celebration, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Facts were moving, exactly as expected. Margaret studied him for a moment. Most clients would have enjoyed this stage. The stage where the other side realized they had misjudged the situation. Quentin didn't. That told her a great deal. Because for him, this had never been about proving someone wrong. It was about protecting what he built and ensuring the truth entered the record. Nothing more, nothing less. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He stared at the screen. The number looked familiar. Milwaukee area code. No contact name. Margaret noticed immediately. Answer it. Quentin did. Slowly, calmly. He lifted the phone. Hello? For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a voice finally emerged. Lauren. Her voice. The first direct call since filing for divorce. Neither anger nor confidence remained, only uncertainty. Quentin. The diner noise seemed to fade. Outside, snow drifted beneath the streetlights. Inside, Quentin waited, listening, because after weeks of silence, Lauren Wallace was finally calling the one person she should have spoken to before filing the divorce papers. Quentin. Lauren's voice sounded unfamiliar, not because of the tone, because of what was missing. Confidence. For weeks, every decision she made had been supported by certainty. Certainty that she understood the situation. Certainty that she understood Quentin. Certainty that the divorce would follow a predictable path. Now that certainty was gone. Quentin sat quietly inside the diner booth. Snow drifted outside the windows. Margaret Reed remained across from him, pretending not to listen, though she missed very little. Yes, Quentin said. A pause followed. Lauren seemed unsure how to begin. Finally, she asked a question. What is North Harbor Holdings? Direct, simple. Quentin stared into his coffee. For a moment, he considered the irony. 15 years of marriage, thousands of conversations, and only now was she asking, It's my company. Another pause. I know that now. The answer came softly. Why didn't you tell me? Quentin looked through the diner window. Streetlights reflected off fresh snow. I did. Silence. Longer this time, because Lauren understood exactly what he meant. The memories had already started returning. Business discussions she ignored. Expansion plans she dismissed. Conversations she stopped listening to years earlier. Eventually, she spoke again. Can we talk? Quentin considered the question, then gave the only answer that made sense. We are talking. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. No arguments, no accusations, no emotional speeches. When the call ended, Quentin placed the phone on the table. Margaret waited, then asked, How do you feel? The answer arrived immediately. The same. Margaret smiled slightly. That was probably true. The following Monday, discovery officially began. For most divorcing couples, discovery felt abstract. Just paperwork, forms, requests, deadlines. For attorneys, it was something else entirely. Discovery was where stories met evidence, and evidence rarely cared about anyone's narrative. By 8 o'clock that morning, requests for production of documents had already been exchanged. Bank statements, credit card records, tax returns, corporate filings, property records, investment accounts, business interests, everything. Both sides were now required to disclose information under oath. The rules were strict. Mistakes could be corrected. Intentional omissions could become very expensive. Margaret Reed welcomed the process because evidence favored preparation, and preparation was where Quentin excelled. Over the next several days, conference rooms in Madison and Milwaukee filled with documents. Boxes arrived, electronic records were uploaded, financial statements spanning years entered the legal process. Margaret's team organized everything methodically: color-coded files, chronological timelines, corporate structures, account histories. Nothing was left to chance. One morning, Quentin arrived at Margaret's office carrying 3 additional binders: maintenance contracts, corporate acquisition records, equipment inventories. Margaret glanced at them and laughed softly. Most clients show up with excuses. Quentin placed the binders on the table. "I brought paperwork." Exactly. That difference was becoming increasingly important. Across Milwaukee, Gavin Pierce faced a different challenge. Every new disclosure made Lauren's position weaker, not because Quentin had hidden assets, because he hadn't. The records were remarkably transparent. North Harbor Holdings existed, the ownership structure existed, the business history existed. Everything was documented, everything was legal, everything was traceable. The problem wasn't concealment, the problem was Lauren's assumptions. Gavin reviewed hundreds of pages. The conclusion remained the same. Quentin had built a legitimate business, a substantial one, and many of the foundational structures supporting it predated key marital disputes. That reality complicated Lauren's expectations dramatically. By midweek, the first formal discovery conference took place. Not in a courtroom, just attorneys reviewing disclosures. Margaret arrived carrying 3 organized binders. Gavin arrived carrying 2. The difference wasn't accidental. Preparation mattered. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Questions moved back and forth. Clarifications. Requests. Follow-up documentation. Nothing dramatic. Yet every answer strengthened Margaret's position. North Harbor's records remained clean. Revenue matched disclosures, tax filings matched bank records, corporate ownership matched registration documents. No surprises, no hidden accounts, no mysterious transfers, nothing. The consistency impressed even Gavin. Later that afternoon, he sat alone reviewing another category of records: Lauren's spending. The pattern continued, troubling him. The more documentation arrived, the clearer things became. Luxury purchases, travel expenditures, repeated charges connected to the Langford Hotel, consulting payments linked to Ethan Cole. Individually, each item could potentially be explained. Collectively, the explanations became more difficult. Gavin leaned back in his chair, then picked up the phone. "Lauren," she answered immediately. "Did something happen?" "Yes." His voice remained professional, always professional. "I need complete transparency." The request sounded simple. The meaning wasn't. Lauren understood immediately. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking whether there's anything I should know before opposing counsel finds it." The silence lasted several seconds. Too long. Much too long. Gavin noticed. Attorneys always noticed. Eventually, Lauren answered, "No." The response sounded firm, but not convincing. Meanwhile, Margaret's team continued building timelines. Every transaction entered a database. Every expenditure received context. Every document found its place. Late Thursday afternoon, one of Margaret's forensic accountants entered her office carrying fresh reports. The accountant pointed toward several highlighted entries. Margaret reviewed them carefully, then reviewed them again. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the timeline now showed a pattern extending beyond personal spending. Certain withdrawals appeared connected to accounts partially funded through marital assets. The amounts were not catastrophic, but they were significant. More importantly, they appeared concentrated during a specific period, the same period associated with Ethan Cole, the same period associated with repeated Langford Hotel charges. Patterns, again, always patterns. Margaret called Quentin immediately. He arrived the next morning, coffee in hand. notebook under his arm, as usual. She handed him the updated timeline. For several minutes he reviewed it silently. Eventually he looked up. "How bad is it?" Margaret answered carefully. "We don't know yet." That answer frustrated many clients, not Quentin, because he understood something most people didn't. Good attorneys hated guessing, evidence first, conclusions later. Margaret pointed toward the highlighted section. "We're seeing concentration," meaning the financial behavior changed. When she tapped a date, 18 months earlier. Quentin stared at it. Recognition flickered briefly, because 18 months earlier was approximately when Lauren became heavily involved in Ethan Cole's professional circles. Not proof, just timing. Still, timing mattered. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Quentin prepared to leave, Margaret handed him another document, a court notice. The judge had reviewed preliminary discovery disputes. Both parties would be required to provide complete supplemental disclosures. No shortcuts, no omissions, no exceptions. Everything. Margaret smiled as Quentin read it. "This helps us." How? Because facts don't care who tells the better story. Outside the office window, snow had finally stopped. The sky looked clear for the first time in days. Quentin folded the notice and placed it inside his notebook. The legal process was accelerating now. The comfortable assumptions that once protected Lauren were disappearing. Soon every financial record would sit under the same light. Every transaction, every transfer, every statement. And somewhere inside those records, Margaret remained convinced she would find the answer to a question that still bothered her. Not whether Ethan Cole was involved. That answer was becoming increasingly obvious. The real question was how much Lauren had risked believing Quentin Wallace would never look closely enough to notice. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had become the center of Lauren Wallace's expectations. Not North Harbor Holdings, not the business interests, not the corporate assets, the house. Because in Lauren's mind, the house represented certainty. It was visible, tangible, simple. A 4-bedroom property in Brookfield with a stone exterior, a finished basement, and a backyard overlooking a protected green space. 15 years earlier, it had symbolized a beginning. Now, it represented an ending. And Lauren believed it would be the strongest piece of her divorce case. That belief lasted until Margaret Reed began examining the purchase records. The process started with a simple question. Where did the down payment come from? In most divorces, the answer was straightforward. Joint savings, shared income, marital funds. This case was different. Margaret sat in her Madison office, surrounded by bank records dating back nearly 2 decades. The documents had arrived from multiple financial institutions. Some were old enough to predate Quentin and Lauren's marriage. Most attorneys would have ignored records that old. Margaret never did. Patterns often began long before people realized they mattered. She traced deposits, transfers, account balances, and eventually she found what she was looking for, a wire transfer, dated 14 months before Quentin and Lauren's wedding. The amount exceeded $200,000. The source account belonged solely to Quentin Wallace. The money had originated from an inheritance received after his grandfather's death. Margaret reviewed the records twice, then a third time. The documentation was flawless. Probate records, bank statements, transfer confirmations. Everything aligned perfectly. The down payment for the Brookfield home came almost entirely from Quentin's separate funds, not marital funds, separate funds. That distinction carried enormous legal significance. The following morning, Quentin sat across from Margaret as she walked him through the discovery. "You remembered this?" Quentin nodded. "My grandfather." Margaret slid several documents toward him. "He helped you buy the house." "Indirectly." Quentin looked down at the paperwork. For a moment, memories returned. His grandfather's small workshop, long afternoons repairing engines, lessons about patience, lessons about work, lessons about building something slowly. The inheritance had never felt like a gift. It felt like responsibility. He had used most of it for the down payment. The rest helped launch what would eventually become North Harbor. Margaret continued, "The records are extremely clear. Good, very good, because clarity mattered, especially in court, especially when large financial claims entered the discussion." Later that week, formal property disclosures were exchanged. Lauren's legal team received copies. So did Gavin Pierce. He reviewed them carefully. The implications became obvious almost immediately. The house wasn't as simple as Lauren believed. Not even close. Ownership claims depended heavily on contribution, and contribution required evidence. The evidence favored Quentin, substantially. That afternoon, Gavin requested a meeting with Lauren. She arrived carrying a notebook and a growing sense of anxiety. Every week seemed to bring another complication, another surprise, another document she had never expected to see. Gavin closed the office door, then handed her several pages. "What is this?" Lauren skimmed the documents. Property records, bank statements, closing disclosures, mortgage paperwork. She frowned. "I don't understand." "The down payment. What about it?" Gavin leaned forward. "It came from Quentin." Lauren stared at him. "No." "Yes. He didn't have that kind of money." Gavin remained silent. Lauren immediately realized how weak the statement sounded, because she no longer trusted her own assumptions. Not after North Harbor, not after discovery, not after everything emerging from the financial records. Gavin pointed toward a highlighted section. "These are probate records." Another section. "These are transfer records." Another. "These are closing documents." Everything matched. Everything connected. Everything was documented. Lauren sat back slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. "What does this mean?" Gavin answered carefully. "It means the house may not be divided the way you expected." The words settled heavily, because for the first time Lauren understood that almost every major assumption underlying her divorce strategy was collapsing. Meanwhile, Margaret continued strengthening the record. Property records alone weren't enough. Supporting evidence mattered. So her team contacted contractors, service providers, inspectors, anyone involved with major improvements to the property. The responses arrived quickly. Roof replacement. Quentin paid. Basement renovation. Quentin paid. HVAC upgrade. Quentin paid. Landscape redesign. Quentin paid. The records extended back years. Invoices, checks, permits, photographs. Again and again the same pattern emerged. When major expenses appeared, Quentin funded them. The evidence didn't require opinions. It spoke for itself. Several neighbors also provided statements. Nothing dramatic, nothing controversial. Simple observations. Who maintained the property? Who coordinated repairs? Who met contractors? Who handled improvements? The answers were remarkably consistent. Quentin. Always Quentin. One neighbor remembered seeing him replace sections of fencing during an entire summer. Another remembered him spending weekends rebuilding the deck. Another recalled helping him move materials for landscaping projects. Small details, yet collectively powerful. Margaret organized everything, every statement, every invoice, every receipt, every photograph. By Friday, the house file alone filled nearly 2 binders. Quentin reviewed the material without emotion. The house mattered, but not for the reason many people assumed. He wasn't fighting for a building. He was protecting accuracy, because inaccurate stories had already caused enough damage. Late Friday afternoon, Margaret received another update. Not regarding the house, regarding Ethan Cole. The subpoena process had begun. Officially. The paperwork moved through legal channels with predictable speed. Financial relationships, business communications, relevant records. The requests were carefully drafted, legally narrow, difficult to challenge. Margaret smiled when she reviewed them. The timing was perfect. Across Milwaukee, Ethan probably still believed he existed safely outside the divorce. That assumption wouldn't survive much longer. The following Monday brought a status conference involving both legal teams. No judge, no courtroom, just attorneys discussing outstanding discovery issues. The atmosphere remained professional, yet tension lingered beneath the surface. Margaret presented updated property documentation. Gavin listened, took notes, asked questions. None of the answers helped Lauren's position. By the end of the meeting, even Gavin could see where the issue was heading. The house would not be the easy victory Lauren once expected, not remotely. Afterward, Margaret and Quentin walked toward the parking garage. Cold wind swept through downtown Madison. Snow crunched beneath their shoes. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. One battle at a time. Quentin nodded. The house, the finances, the disclosures. Everything was moving exactly as it should. Then Margaret added something unexpected. Ethan received the subpoena. Quentin stopped walking, not dramatically, just enough. Margaret noticed. What happens now? She looked toward the gray Wisconsin sky. Now we find out how much he wants to protect. The answer lingered between them, because subpoenas changed things. They transformed rumors into testimony, assumptions into sworn statements, and if Ethan Cole had information relevant to the divorce, he would soon face a choice: tell the truth, or explain why he didn't. 3 days later, Ethan's attorney contacted both legal teams. The response was brief, professional, expected. Ethan would appear. And for the first time since the divorce began, someone outside the marriage was about to enter the spotlight. The deposition took place on a gray Wednesday morning in Milwaukee. No courtroom, no jury, no dramatic speeches, just a conference room. A long wooden table, several attorneys, a court reporter, and Ethan Cole. The room occupied the 15th floor of a downtown office building overlooking the Milwaukee River. Outside, winter clouds hung low over the city. Inside, tension settled into every empty chair. Quentin arrived early, as usual. He wore a dark blue button-down shirt and a plain gray jacket. Nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress. Margaret Reed sat beside him, reviewing notes. Across the room, Gavin Pierce organized documents for Lauren. Lauren herself sat quietly near the far end of the table. For perhaps the first time since filing for divorce, she appeared genuinely uncertain. Not scared, not defeated, uncertain. The distinction mattered. At exactly 9 o'clock, Ethan Cole entered. 44 years old, well-dressed, confident. The kind of confidence often developed by successful people who spend years negotiating deals and controlling conversations. His attorney walked beside him. Both took their seats. The court reporter administered the oath. Then everything began. Margaret started with basic questions: professional background, business history, corporate interests, educational history. Nothing controversial, nothing aggressive. Experienced attorneys rarely started aggressively. They started patiently, building foundations, establishing facts, creating records. Ethan answered comfortably. His confidence remained intact. For nearly 30 minutes, the conversation felt routine. Then Margaret shifted direction. When did you first meet Lauren Wallace? Ethan adjusted slightly in his chair. The movement was small, yet Quentin noticed it. Margaret noticed it too. The answer came quickly. Several years ago. Approximately how many years? 3. Margaret nodded. Under what circumstances? A real estate networking event. Another answer, another piece of the record. The questions continued. Professional interactions, industry conferences, business dinners, charity events. Nothing inappropriate, nothing shocking, at least not yet. Then Margaret opened a different folder, the Langford Hotel records. The atmosphere changed immediately, not dramatically, just enough. Margaret slid several documents across the table. Do you recognize these? Ethan glanced down. His expression remained controlled. Looks like hotel records. They are. Margaret folded her hands. Were you present at the Langford Hotel on these dates? A pause. Not long, just long enough. Yes. Margaret nodded. With Lauren Wallace. Another pause. Sometimes. The answer echoed softly through the room. Lauren stared at the table. Quentin remained motionless. Margaret continued. The questions became more precise. Private dining reservations, conference suites, business meetings, expense records. Every answer narrowed possibilities. Every answer eliminated uncertainty. Eventually, Margaret reached the issue that mattered. The consulting payments. Several highlighted documents appeared. Bank transfers, invoices, financial records, all linked to Ethan's consulting company. Margaret pushed the documents forward. Can you explain these? Ethan examined them carefully, then looked up. They were consulting fees. For what services? Business development. Whose business? Lauren's. The answer surprised several people in the room, not because it was impossible, because it was the first direct explanation anyone had offered. Margaret reviewed another document. Do you have written agreements? Yes. Do you have deliverables? Yes. Do you have supporting documentation? Some. Margaret made a note, then another. The answers weren't disastrous, but they weren't particularly strong either, because legitimate consulting relationships typically left paper trails. Strong paper trails. Margaret intended to see all of them. The deposition continued. Hour after hour, slowly, methodically, then came the moment nobody expected, not even Ethan. Margaret displayed a series of text message records, not message contents, just metadata, dates, times, communication frequency. Nothing private, everything legally obtained. The pattern spoke for itself. Extensive communication, months of it, sometimes dozens of contacts per day. Margaret asked a simple question. Would you describe your relationship with Lauren Wallace as strictly professional? Ethan hesitated. For the first time all morning, the confidence faded. Only slightly, but enough. His attorney leaned forward. A brief discussion followed. Then Ethan answered, but no. The room became very quiet. Margaret didn't react. Neither did Quentin. Only the court reporter's keyboard continued moving. Click, 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 recording every word. Margaret continued. How would you describe it? Ethan looked down, then back up. Personal. No further explanation. None needed. The answer landed heavily enough on its own. Across the room, Lauren closed her eyes briefly. Quentin noticed, but only as an observation, nothing more. Margaret moved forward, not because she wanted drama, because facts mattered, always facts. The next 30 minutes focused on timelines, when relationships changed, when communications increased, when financial transactions occurred, when hotel visits happened. Piece by piece, the chronology emerged. Not every detail, not every answer. Enough. Enough to understand the broader picture. Enough to understand that Lauren's assumptions about Quentin had influenced more than her marriage. They had influenced her legal strategy, and now that strategy was collapsing. Near the end of the deposition, Margaret asked one final question, a simple one, yet perhaps the most important. Did Lauren ever discuss her expectations regarding the divorce? Ethan shifted again. His attorney objected. Margaret rephrased. The objection disappeared. Then Ethan answered. The response came slowly, carefully, as though he already regretted speaking. Yes, Margaret nodded. What did she say? The room seemed smaller, quieter. Even the heating system became noticeable. A low hum beneath the silence. Finally, Ethan spoke. She thought Quentin wouldn't fight. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan continued. She said he was tired. Another pause. She said he hated conflict. Another. She believed he would sign almost anything just to avoid a legal battle. The words hung in the air, cold, heavy, permanent, because they were now part of the record, official, documented, under oath. Quentin listened without visible emotion, yet Margaret noticed something. Not anger, not satisfaction, disappointment, a very specific kind. The kind created when someone finally hears the truth about how they were viewed. Not by strangers, by someone who once promised to know them best. The deposition ended shortly after noon. Ethan left with his attorney. The court reporter packed her equipment. Documents disappeared into briefcases. The room slowly emptied. Only Quentin and Margaret remained. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Margaret opened her folder, removed a single document, and placed it on the table. Unlike the previous evidence, this document was old, very old, several years old. The paper itself looked ordinary, yet Margaret's expression suggested otherwise. Quentin glanced at the title, then looked up. Recognition immediately appeared, for the first time in weeks. Margaret tapped the page. "I almost forgot about this." Quentin studied it quietly, because he knew exactly what it was. And more importantly, he knew Lauren had probably forgotten it existed. Margaret smiled slightly, not a triumphant smile, the smile of someone who had just found the final piece of a puzzle, because lying in front of them was a document signed years earlier, a document Lauren barely glanced at before signing, a document capable of changing the entire direction of the divorce. And once Gavin Pierce saw it, everything would look very different. The document was only 7 pages long, no dramatic title, no bold warnings, no language designed to attract attention, just a standard legal agreement drafted 6 years earlier. Yet as Margaret Reed looked at it resting on the conference table, she understood something important. Entire divorce cases had turned on far less. Quentin picked up the document and flipped through it slowly. He already knew what it contained. The memory remained clear, not because the agreement itself had been remarkable, because of the day it was signed. Margaret leaned back. "Tell me exactly how this happened." Quentin nodded. The answer carried him 6 years into the past. Back to 2020, back to a different version of his marriage. At the time, North Harbor Holdings was expanding rapidly. Several acquisitions were underway. New service territories were being added. Additional financing arrangements were being negotiated. Corporate attorneys had recommended something, a post-nuptial agreement, nothing unusual. Successful business owners signed them all the time, not to punish spouses, not to hide assets, to clarify ownership structures and reduce future disputes. Quentin remembered bringing the documents home one evening, the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee, stacks of business paperwork, a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. Margaret listened carefully. What did Lauren say? Quentin almost smiled. The memory was strangely specific. She asked if it was more business paperwork, and I said yes. Margaret already suspected the rest. What happened next? Quentin looked down at the agreement. She signed it. Immediately, almost. The answer carried no bitterness, only fact. Lauren had barely reviewed the document, not because anyone pressured her, not because anything was hidden, because she simply wasn't interested. The agreement represented another one of Quentin's business discussions, another corporate document, another topic she no longer cared about. She signed where indicated, returned the paperwork, and moved on with her evening. Margaret shook her head slightly. Experienced attorneys saw this repeatedly. People ignored documents they considered boring, until those documents became important. Then they wished they had paid attention. The following morning, Margaret arranged a meeting with Gavin Pierce. The purpose was simple: review newly discovered materials, clarify remaining issues, continue settlement discussions, professional, routine, necessary. The conference room inside Gavin's office felt noticeably different than previous meetings. The confidence that once surrounded Lauren's case had faded, not disappeared entirely, faded. Each new disclosure seemed to narrow available options. Each new record seemed to strengthen Quentin's position. Margaret arrived carrying several binders. One of them contained the post-nuptial agreement. Gavin noticed immediately. "What is that?" Margaret placed the document on the table. "You should read it." Nothing more, nothing less. Gavin opened the file. The room became quiet. Page 1, page 2, page 3. By page 4, his expression changed. Margaret noticed. So did Quentin. By page 6, Gavin stopped reading, then started again, carefully, very carefully, because the language was clear, remarkably clear. North Harbor Holdings, future subsidiaries. associated business entities, expansion assets, corporate growth, ownership rights. Everything had been addressed. Everything had been separated. Everything had been documented, and at the bottom sat Lauren's signature. Properly witnessed, properly notarized, properly executed, legally valid. Gavin closed the document. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then he looked at Margaret. "When did you find this?" "A few weeks ago." "And you waited?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I was waiting for the right moment." The answer irritated him, which was exactly why she gave it. Not out of cruelty. Strategy. Timing mattered, especially in litigation. Gavin reopened the agreement, then examined the signature page. No obvious challenges appeared. No procedural flaws, no missing requirements, no indication that Lauren had been coerced. Everything looked clean, very clean. The kind of clean attorneys disliked when representing the wrong side. Later that afternoon, Gavin met privately with Lauren. She arrived expecting updates. Instead, she found a copy of the post-nuptial agreement waiting on the conference table. The moment she saw her signature, confusion appeared. "What is this?" Gavin slid the document toward her. "You signed it." Lauren frowned. "When?" "6 years ago." She picked it up, started reading, slowly, then more slowly. The room remained silent except for turning pages. The realization unfolded gradually, painfully. Paragraph after paragraph, clause after clause, definition after definition. North Harbor Holdings, future business acquisitions, corporate interests, separate property designations, protection provisions, ownership structures. Every page seemed to make the situation worse. Lauren finally looked up. "I don't remember this." Gavin nodded. "I believe you." "Then how?" "You signed it." The answer sounded brutal, because it was. Not emotionally, legally. The law cared far more about signatures than memories. Lauren continued reading. The frustration in her face grew, then disbelief, then something else. Recognition. Small fragments of memory returning. The kitchen table, the coffee, the paperwork. Quentin talking about business expansion, her impatience, her boredom, the feeling that none of it mattered. At the time, she wanted the conversation finished, nothing more, nothing less. Now that decision sat in front of her. 7 pages, 1 signature, 6 years old, and potentially worth millions. Across town, Quentin spent the afternoon at a service facility outside Milwaukee. A technician needed guidance on a compressor failure. 3 trucks required maintenance scheduling. A customer contract needed review. Normal problems, predictable problems, problems with solutions. The divorce remained present in his life, but it no longer controlled it. Margaret called shortly before 5. "How did it go?" "About as expected." Quentin stepped outside into the cold air. "And—" Margaret laughed quietly. "And Gavin isn't happy." That answer required no explanation, because unhappy attorneys usually meant difficult facts. Facts were becoming difficult for Lauren. Very difficult. The next several days produced a noticeable shift in negotiations. Requests changed, questions changed, positions changed. The certainty that once defined Lauren's strategy was gone. In its place stood reality. Financial reality, legal reality, documented reality. Margaret reviewed the latest settlement communications with growing confidence. Not confidence based on emotion, confidence based on evidence. The strongest kind. One afternoon, she received revised proposals from Gavin's office. The differences were obvious immediately. Claims had been reduced, demands had been narrowed. Certain asset requests had disappeared entirely. Margaret read every page, then called Quentin. "Things are changing." "How much?" "Enough." The answer pleased him less than most people would expect, because victory had never been the objective. Accuracy had. Still, accuracy was finally arriving, slowly, methodically, inevitably. That evening, Margaret remained alone in her office reviewing final notes. Settlement discussions were approaching. Formal mediation would likely follow. The case was entering its final stages, yet one question remained. Not about North Harbor, not about the house, not about Ethan Cole. A simpler question, a more human question. Why had Lauren never cared enough to read the document? Margaret suspected the answer wasn't legal. It wasn't financial either. It was something much older, something far more common. People often ignored things they believed had no value until they discovered the value later. Then they called it a mistake. The next morning, official notice arrived. Both parties would attend mediation. Settlement discussions would begin. And for the first time since filing for divorce, Lauren Wallace would walk into a room knowing exactly how much she had misunderstood about the man she thought she knew. The mediation took place on a Thursday morning in late February. Snow covered the sidewalks outside the Milwaukee office building. Inside, everything felt controlled. Neutral walls, neutral furniture, neutral lighting. The kind of environment designed to remove emotion from difficult conversations. Whether it succeeded was another matter entirely. Quentin Wallace arrived 10 minutes early, as always. He carried a leather portfolio containing documents Margaret Reed had already reviewed dozens of times. Most of the paperwork would never leave the folder. That wasn't the point. Preparation mattered. Across the waiting area, Lauren Wallace sat beside Gavin Pierce. Months earlier, she would have entered the room expecting victory. Now she entered hoping to limit damage. The difference was significant. The mediator, a retired Wisconsin judge named Thomas Hensley, greeted both sides shortly after 9. His reputation was excellent, calm, patient, practical, the type of mediator attorneys respected because he focused on solutions instead of theatrics. Everyone gathered in the conference room. The opening formalities lasted less than 15 minutes. Then the real work began. Hensley reviewed the major issues: the house, financial accounts, business interests, outstanding disputes, potential reimbursement claims, future obligations, one by one, methodically, professionally. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just facts. And facts had become increasingly difficult for Lauren's side. The first several hours focused on property division. Many issues were resolved quickly. Some accounts would be divided. Others would remain separate. Retirement assets would be handled according to existing documentation. The process moved steadily. Then they reached the more complicated topics: the house and the financial reimbursements. Margaret opened a binder. Several documents were placed before the mediator: property records, inheritance records, maintenance records, improvement costs, everything already familiar, everything already verified. Hensley reviewed the material carefully, then nodded. The direction became obvious. The house was no longer the leverage point Lauren once imagined. Not after the documentation, not after the inheritance records, not after the maintenance history. The discussion moved on. Then came the financial expenditures. The atmosphere changed, only slightly, but enough. Margaret presented summaries of unauthorized spending connected to marital and business-related accounts. Again, no exaggeration, no emotional language. Just records, dates, amounts, transactions. The numbers spoke for themselves. Lauren sat quietly while the documents circulated. The receipts looked different now, not because they had changed, because context had changed. Each charge that once felt insignificant now appeared inside a legal file. Viewed through the lens of accountability, viewed through the lens of evidence. That made everything look different. Hours passed. Coffee was refilled. Notes accumulated. The mediator moved between positions, clarifying, explaining, testing possibilities. By early afternoon, a settlement framework began emerging. Not perfect, not painless, realistic. Margaret reviewed the proposed structure, then looked toward Quentin. "What do you think?" Quentin studied the numbers. Several minutes passed. The room remained quiet. Finally, he answered, "It's fair." The response surprised no one who knew him. Fairness had always mattered more than revenge. He could have demanded more. Margaret knew it. Gavin knew it. Even Lauren knew it. The reimbursement claims alone could have been pushed harder. The business issues could have become more aggressive. The litigation could have continued for months, possibly longer. Quentin wanted none of that. He wanted resolution, accuracy, closure, nothing else. The mediator nodded approvingly. Those qualities made settlements possible. Eventually, revised documents were drafted. New numbers entered. Old demands disappeared. The gap between both sides narrowed. Slowly, steadily, until finally the framework became an agreement, not final, yet close, very close. The room relaxed slightly. Tension remained, but the outcome was becoming visible. Then something unexpected happened. Lauren spoke. Not to the mediator, not to Gavin, to Quentin. The first direct question she had asked him in weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Everyone looked toward her. The room became quiet again. Quentin nodded. "What?" Lauren hesitated, as though uncertain whether she truly wanted the answer. Then she continued. "When did all of this happen?" No one needed clarification. The question wasn't about the divorce, or the settlement, or North Harbor. It was about everything, the company, the wealth, the success, the life she had somehow failed to notice. Quentin considered the question, then answered honestly. "Years ago." Lauren looked confused. "I mean, when did you become successful?" A faint expression crossed Quentin's face. Not amusement. Something closer to sadness. "That's the problem." "What?" "I didn't." The answer puzzled her. Quentin continued. "I didn't suddenly become successful." The room remained silent. "I spent 10 years building it. No accusation, no bitterness, just truth." He looked toward the settlement documents, then back toward Lauren. "You were there." The words landed harder than any argument could have, because they were true. Lauren had been there for the meetings, the conversations, the business trips, the acquisitions, the contracts, the late nights, the weekends, the sacrifices. She simply stopped paying attention, not because the information was hidden, because she no longer considered it important. The mediator quietly excused himself for a brief break, an experienced professional recognizing a moment that did not require interruption. Margaret remained silent. So did Gavin. The conversation belonged to Quentin now. Lauren stared at the table. For perhaps the first time, she seemed less concerned about money than regret. A different emotion, a heavier one. Eventually, she spoke again. "I thought—" The sentence died halfway. Quentin waited. "I thought you were just—" She stopped, unable to finish, because she finally understood what the sentence would reveal. Just a repairman, just a technician, just a man driving an old van. The assumption sounded foolish now. Quentin rescued her from finishing it. "I know. Nothing more, nothing less." The simplicity somehow made it worse. Several minutes later, the mediator returned. Work resumed. The remaining details were finalized. Payment schedules, asset allocations, documentation requirements, deadlines. The legal language replaced personal history, just as it always did. By 5 o'clock, the agreement was complete, not signed, ready for signature, a meaningful distinction. Everyone reviewed the final draft carefully. Margaret insisted on it. Every clause, every paragraph, every number, nothing would be rushed, not after everything that had happened. As the meeting finally ended, Lauren gathered her papers slowly. The confidence that once defined her had disappeared entirely, not destroyed, replaced by understanding. Sometimes understanding arrived too late. Sometimes it arrived exactly when it was supposed to. No one could say which applied here. The participants began leaving the conference room, one by one. The mediator first, then assistants, then Gavin. Eventually, only Quentin and Lauren remained near the doorway. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lauren asked one final question, a question she had apparently carried for weeks, perhaps months, perhaps longer. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Why didn't you ever tell me what you had?" Quentin looked at her, not angrily, not triumphantly, simply looking. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he drew a slow breath, because the answer had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what comes next. "Why didn't you ever tell me what you had?" Lauren's question lingered in the empty conference room. Outside the large windows, Milwaukee's winter sky was fading toward evening. The mediation session had ended. The paperwork sat neatly stacked on the table. Most people were gone. Only Quentin Wallace and Lauren remained. For a moment, neither moved. Neither seemed eager to leave. Not because there was anything left to save. That chapter had already closed, but some questions deserved answers, and Lauren had finally asked one. Quentin looked at her quietly, then pulled out a chair and sat back down. The movement surprised her. For months, every conversation between them had revolved around attorneys, documents, and negotiations. Now, for the first time, they were simply two people sitting across from each other. No judge, no mediator, no witnesses, just truth. Lauren waited. Finally, Quentin spoke. "I never hid anything." The answer wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it was simply factual. Lauren looked down at the settlement papers, then back at him. "It felt hidden." Quentin nodded slightly. "I know." Silence settled between them. Then he continued. "You remember when I bought Harbor Mechanical?" Lauren blinked. The question seemed random, yet she remembered. Vaguely. A small refrigeration company somewhere in Green Bay, years ago. At the time, she barely understood why he cared about it. "I remember. You thought it was a bad idea." A faint smile crossed her face despite everything. "Because it looked like a terrible investment." It was. The answer surprised her. Quentin almost smiled. At first, for a moment, memories surfaced. Long nights, old spreadsheets, business plans spread across the kitchen table, phone calls during dinner, weekends spent driving across Wisconsin, years she had mostly forgotten or ignored. Quentin leaned back slightly. "When I bought that company, I thought I was building something for us." Lauren looked away. The words hurt more than accusations would have, because accusations could be argued. Facts could not. "I worked because I believed we were building a future." His voice remained calm, steady, exactly the way it had remained throughout the divorce. No bitterness, no self-pity, just honesty. "The money wasn't the goal." Lauren frowned slightly. "Then what was?" Quentin answered immediately. "See, security." The word hung in the air, simple, powerful, real. "I grew up watching people lose everything." He looked toward the window. Snow drifted through the fading daylight. "My grandfather taught me something." Lauren remained silent. "He said money isn't freedom." Another pause. "He said stability is freedom." The sentence explained more than years of financial statements ever could. Everything suddenly made sense. The old van, the modest lifestyle, the absence of luxury purchases, the refusal to show off, the refusal to play status games. North Harbor had never been about becoming rich. It had been about making sure tomorrow remained predictable. Lauren slowly lowered her eyes. For the first time, she realized how completely she had misunderstood him. Not recently, for years, perhaps longer. Quentin continued. "I didn't need people knowing what I had." His gaze returned to hers. "I wanted people to know who I was." The words landed heavily, because Lauren knew exactly what he meant. Over time, she had stopped evaluating Quentin based on character. She began evaluating him through comparison. Comparison to investors, developers, executives, people who advertised success, people who displayed success, people who talked about success. Meanwhile, Quentin simply worked, and because he worked quietly, she assumed he wasn't moving forward. One assumption, repeated over years, eventually becoming belief. Lauren swallowed hard. "I didn't realize." The answer sounded small, insufficient, yet it was the truth. Quentin nodded. "I know." Again, no anger, no attack, just acknowledgement. The absence of hostility somehow made everything worse. Because Lauren had spent months preparing for conflict, she never prepared for grace. Several minutes passed. Neither spoke. The conference room seemed strangely peaceful now, as though the legal battle had finally exhausted itself. Then Lauren asked another question, a more difficult one. "Did you ever stop loving me?" The answer mattered, perhaps not legally, but personally, very personally. Quentin looked down briefly, thinking, not because he didn't know, because he wanted to answer honestly. Finally, he spoke. "No." Lauren's eyes widened slightly. The answer wasn't what she expected. Quentin continued, "I stopped recognizing us." The distinction mattered a lot, because love and trust weren't always lost at the same moment. Sometimes one survived longer than the other, sometimes much longer. "I kept waiting." Lauren felt her throat tighten. "For what? For you to care again." The sentence arrived quietly, without accusation, without drama, and because of that, it felt devastating. Quentin looked toward the settlement papers, toward the documents that officially ended 15 years of marriage. "I wasn't waiting for you to admire me." His voice remained steady. "I wasn't waiting for you to be impressed." Another pause. "I was waiting for you to be interested." Lauren closed her eyes. The truth hurt, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Memory after memory returned, conversations interrupted, business discussions ignored, questions never asked, achievements dismissed. Entire chapters of Quentin's life she never bothered reading, not because she hated him, because she assumed she already knew him. That assumption had cost her more than money. It had cost her understanding. Eventually Quentin stood. The conversation was ending. There was nothing left to fight about, nothing left to prove. Only acceptance remained. Lauren looked up. "What's next?" Quentin glanced toward the door, then back at her. "I signed the papers." Simple, direct, final. The official signing took place 3 weeks later. A quiet morning, a conference room, several signatures, several notarizations. Nothing dramatic. The marriage ended with the same calm that had characterized Quentin's approach throughout the process. No speeches, no celebrations, no revenge, just completion. When the final signature dried, the attorneys exchanged copies. The legal process was over. Margaret gathered her files. Gavin did the same. Lauren sat silently, watching, processing, accepting. Quentin reviewed the final page one last time. Every term, every figure, every obligation, correct. Exactly as agreed. Only then did he sign. Margaret noticed. She appreciated that. Details mattered, always, especially at the end. A few minutes later, Quentin exited the building alone. Cold rain had replaced the snow. The sidewalks glistened beneath gray clouds. Traffic moved through downtown Milwaukee. People hurried between offices. Life continued, as it always did. Quentin stopped beneath the awning for a moment. Rain tapped against concrete. The city sounded distant, muted. For the first time in months, there were no upcoming hearings, no depositions, no discovery deadlines, no negotiations, only open space, an unfamiliar feeling, yet not an unpleasant one. He stepped into the rain. The cold water soaked his jacket almost immediately. He didn't care. The weight he had carried for months was gone, not because he won, because the truth had finally reached the surface, and sometimes that was enough. As Quentin walked toward his truck, he had no idea what the next chapter would look like, only that it would be his. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Quentin Wallace was standing inside a service facility north of Milwaukee at 6:30 in the morning. The building used to belong to another company, a struggling refrigeration contractor with declining revenue, aging equipment, and too many unresolved problems. Most investors ignored businesses like that. Quentin never did. He understood neglected things, machines, companies, sometimes people. The facility smelled faintly of motor oil, welding steel, and fresh coffee. Technicians were already arriving. Truck engines echoed across the yard. toolboxes rolled across concrete floors. Another workday was beginning. The scene felt familiar, comforting, normal, exactly the way Quentin preferred. A young technician named Tyler approached carrying a clipboard. 22 years old, recently hired, eager, determined, the kind of employee Quentin enjoyed working with. "Morning, morning." Tyler handed over several service reports, equipment schedules, maintenance requests, customer updates. Quentin reviewed them carefully, not because he distrusted anyone, because details mattered. They always had. Tyler watched him for a moment, then asked a question. "Can I ask something?" Quentin looked up. "Sure. Is it true you started out doing repairs yourself?" A faint smile appeared. "Still do." Tyler laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I." The young technician glanced toward the service yard. Several trucks carried North Harbor Holdings logos, more than 40 now, a number that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Most owners don't do that. Quentin closed the clipboard. Most owners forget what the job actually is. The answer stayed with Tyler long after the conversation ended, because that was the difference. Quentin never built North Harbor to impress people. He built it to solve problems. That philosophy hadn't changed. Neither had he. The company continued expanding. Another service territory had recently been added. A new maintenance division launched in Green Bay. Additional contracts were being negotiated with healthcare systems throughout Wisconsin. Revenue increased, staff increased, opportunities increased. Yet Quentin's daily routine remained remarkably similar. Early mornings, job sites, customer meetings, equipment inspections. The work itself still mattered, perhaps more than ever. One afternoon, Margaret Reed visited the facility. Officially, the divorce case was over. The paperwork had long since been completed. Yet professional relationships built through difficult circumstances often lasted. Margaret walked through the service center with visible approval. The operation was impressive, not flashy, efficient, everything organized, everything functioning, everything purposeful. She eventually found Quentin helping a technician troubleshoot a compressor system. Margaret waited until they finished, then approached. "You know you're allowed to sit behind a desk now." Quentin laughed quietly. "That sounds terrible." Margaret shook her head. Some people chase status. Quentin chased usefulness. The distinction explained nearly everything. They spent an hour reviewing business updates. Nothing legal, nothing dramatic, just conversation. Before leaving, Margaret asked a question, one she had wondered about for months. "Any regrets?" Quentin thought about it, long enough to answer honestly, then shook his head. "No." The response surprised her slightly. "None." He looked across the service yard, employees moving between trucks, work orders being completed, people building lives, building careers, building futures the same way he once did. "I regret what happened." Margaret nodded. "But not what I learned." That answer made more sense, because pain often taught lessons comfort never could. Meanwhile, Lauren Wallace's life had changed considerably. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, simply differently. The divorce settlement had been fair. The legal fees had been significant. The financial realities had become unavoidable. Several expensive habits disappeared naturally. The luxury apartment downtown became a smaller condominium. Frequent travel slowed. Spending became more deliberate, more practical. For the first time in years, Lauren began evaluating success differently. Not through appearances, not through status, through substance. The shift happened gradually, the same way most important changes happened, one realization at a time, one lesson at a time, one quiet moment at a time. Occasionally, she saw North Harbor trucks around Milwaukee, service vans, maintenance crews, technicians moving through the city. Each sighting reminded her of something uncomfortable, not the money, not the company, the fact that it had always been there, right in front of her, and she never bothered looking. One evening in early autumn, Quentin received an invitation to speak at a local technical college. The school had developed a skilled trades program. Students wanted practical advice. business advice, career advice, life advice. Quentin initially declined, then reconsidered. The presentation lasted less than an hour. No motivational speeches, no dramatic success stories, just practical observations. Show up, do good work, pay attention, keep learning. The students seemed surprised by the simplicity. One young woman raised her hand near the end. "What was the most important decision you ever made?" The room became quiet. Quentin considered the question. Many possible answers existed. Buying Harbor Mechanical, creating North Harbor, expanding operations, making acquisitions. Yet none felt completely right. Finally, he answered, "Learning to be patient." The students waited, expecting more. There wasn't any. Because patience had built almost everything important in his life. Patience built businesses. Patience built expertise. Patience uncovered truth. Patience prevented expensive mistakes. The lesson sounded simple. Most important lessons did. Months continued passing. Winter became spring. Spring became summer. North Harbor continued growing. New contracts, new employees, new opportunities. Yet the greatest change wasn't financial, it was personal. For the first time in years, Quentin felt light. Not happy every day, not carefree. Human lives didn't work that way. Free. There was a difference. Freedom wasn't excitement, it wasn't luxury, it wasn't wealth. Freedom was waking up without carrying unresolved burdens. Freedom was knowing where you stood. Freedom was truth. One Friday evening in September, Quentin remained at the facility later than usual. The sun hung low above the Wisconsin horizon. Orange light stretched across the service yard. Most employees had already gone home. The building felt quiet, peaceful. Tyler waved goodbye from the parking lot. A few remaining trucks returned from final service calls. Then the yard gradually emptied. Quentin completed one last inspection, reviewed one last report, turned off several lights. The routine felt familiar, almost comforting. He walked toward the front entrance carrying a small tool bag. Outside, the evening air felt cool, the kind of weather Wisconsin delivered just before autumn fully arrived. Quentin paused beside the entrance, looking across the property, looking at everything built over the last decade. Not just buildings, not just revenue, people, careers, opportunities, stability, the things that actually mattered. His phone vibrated once, a service notification, nothing urgent, just tomorrow's work already waiting. Quentin smiled, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The setting sun reflected across the windows of the facility. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly still. Then he locked the front door, turned toward the parking lot, and walked forward, not toward revenge, not toward victory, toward the next ordinary day, the kind of day he had always wanted, the kind of day nobody could take away. Some people mistake quietness for weakness. They see an old truck, worn work boots, or a simple lifestyle, and assume they understand the person standing in front of them. This story reminds us how dangerous that assumption can be. Quentin Wallace never won because he was louder, more aggressive, or more ruthless. He won because he stayed patient. He kept records. He respected the process. And when the truth finally appeared, it didn't need help defending itself. In real life, many of us have experienced something similar. Maybe someone underestimated your abilities. Maybe they judged your value by your job title, your appearance, your income, or the way you carried yourself. The truth is that real character often grows quietly. Real success is usually built long before anyone notices it, and the strongest position is often the one supported by facts rather than emotions. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your worth? And if so, what happened when the truth finally came out? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is about another man who stayed silent while everyone assumed he had lost, until one document changed everything.